Are law and grace opposites?
No. Next question. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here with Daniel, as always. How are you?
Hello. Doing well.
Good to have all of you listeners on board with us for this episode. Before we get too far into it, we'd like to first thank our patrons over at patreon.com/Reason Together. They're the generous folks that support this podcast so we can pay our editor and both of them. But we appreciate them very much. If you'd like to become a patron and support this content, you can go over to patreon.com/Reason Together and sign up for one of the various tier levels there. And there are some perks and benefits afforded to you if you do that. Of course, if you'd like to continue listening for free, you're welcome to do that as well. We still have quite a few folks that do that. Thank a patron. We appreciate you guys very much.
Yes.
All right. Where are we at here?
Oh man, we've got a few questions this evening, and to some degree, I think we're talking about definitions of words.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
that was a joke. That was
it depends.
A meta analytical humor.
There you go. That's good. A good throwback to like one of the defining phrases of Reason Together podcast.
Yep.
So we still need to consider that on a T-shirt. It depends. Period.
It depends. Yes.
Yep.
We should.
So let's start off with this question here. What is the relationship between faith and fear? Faith and fear in Scripture.
What is the relationship between them? The first word that comes to mind is tension.
Okay.
Tension. Only to say that if only, would to God that we were perfect human beings. When we have faith, it would be completely homogeneous and pure. But oftentimes it is back and forth between doubt and faith. And I would conflate doubt somewhat with fear. If I'm being honest, I think of examples like Gideon, where you see him at times a man of very strong faith, and at other times, are you sure, God? Are you sure about this, Lord? And kind of waffling back and forth. I think of men like the disciples who at times demonstrated fairly sincere faith, and at other times they're freaking out because they think that Jesus is going to let them drown. I see the relationship as one of tension only because we are human beings who are prone to have to remind ourselves of the promises of God. I think of examples like Abraham, who really the New Testament admits is an exemplary picture of faith. And yet we see him, having doubt at times, thinking he needs to take matters into his own hands to bring about the seed that God promised. So yeah, I guess that's how I would say the relationship is. It's one of tension.
Okay. Yeah, and there's on kind of a spectrum sometimes of words in various contexts, and so yeah, what you're talking about, I think about that. Is it 1 John where he says, "Perfect love casteth out fear." So there is that aspect of fear that is an afraidness, which is inconsistent with love, and we would say that love, God who is love, and our faith should be in God. I mean, love and faith have to be closely aligned. So yeah, there seems to be an oppositeness there, and yet I think there's also a way in which a proper understanding of fear blends with faith or precedes faith. And this is the way I explain it. When you go to Proverbs fear, when he's talking about the fear of the Lord, the way I explain that is that it would be like standing at a distance, say, and looking at the what's the big waterfall? Niagara Falls, right? You look at Niagara Falls from a distance, and you just stand in awe. Wow, that's an amazing amount of water. The power, the size of that, the crashing sound. Wow, that's amazing, and it just sort of fills us with awe in a way. But that is a form of fear, but it's totally different than the fear that if we were on the river about to go over the Niagara Falls, that's a totally different look at the falls. That's a different perspective of the very same falls. We see its power and we see its majesty, and we're terrified because we're about to suffer the consequences of being improperly related to that power. And so fear is recognizing the power of something, but my relation to that power and majesty has everything to do with whether it looks more like a reverence or whether it looks like terror. And so when I see fear that way, that kind of broad scope of fear that we oftentimes, especially in our English context, see the one side of it, the afraidness, the terror, but we don't see the whole concept of how it could be a reverence and how it could provoke awe. But if we see fear in that broader context, then to say, well, fear, to recognize God for who he is, precedes faith, which says that I will rest on that. I see God. I trust him now. I see who he is in this situation. I stand in awe of him and I rest in him. They're very closely aligned in that way.
Yeah.
So I would say it's the difference, between reliance and reverence, but they're closely
Yeah.
related.
So if I can maybe reword what you're saying in my
Sure.
own words and
Yep.
correct me if I'm not right,
Okay.
is he has the absolute power to utterly destroy me, but
Mhm.
because he loves me, he does not. And I can both reverence and be in awe of his power to destroy me, but have confidence and a lack of fear that he will because he loves me.
That would be part of it, and yet there's so much more to see in God, more than just a power that could destroy me. It would just be, the majesty of who God is, and if I were to violate his command, if I were to counter his design, if I were to stand up to him in rebellion, wow, that would be a fearful thing. And when I stand back, not in fear, but in obedience, it's not simply that he won't punish me. It's just simply for the beauty of who he is, too. It's just that he is a
Yeah.
majestic, powerful, awesome God,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think it's a good thing for Christians to and I think I know your answer based on what you've already said.
Mhm.
Do you think it's wise for a Christian to live sort of in fear of God in the sense that, oh, I have to be so careful today, otherwise he's going to punish me? Should a Christian live that way?
No, I think that would be a wrong perspective of God, because that being in awe of Him, you stand amazed at Him and are
Mhm.
motivated just by who He is to and you learn to just do right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Though certainly there is that terror of disobedience, to just see Him as one waiting to punish, and he's the great the great prison guard, just waiting to thump me, would be an
Yeah.
incorrect perspective of God.
Yeah, it's interesting that this question came up. I was just listening this week to a podcast episode on overcoming fear-based religion,
Mm,
and
mm,
and I think what you're saying would resonate very much with what the host on that episode was saying. And I'll link it in the show notes for our listeners.
mhm.
But yeah, there is a definite distinction in the kinds of fear that people talk about. And no, I don't think it's good for a Christian to live with the perspective that, at any moment God might thump me because
Right, right,
that's the wrong kind of fear.
right, right. Let's jump to some feedback that we've gotten. let me see who this. I don't know who this was from, tell you the truth, but it's a question regarding Matthew 18. Would that be a good one to cover now, or do you want to save that for the after show?
That one's been on there a little bit. We could try it now. I
Yeah.
haven't really read through it here, but
Okay.
we could try it if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So it was written to us. Said recently, I had a Christian friend say to me after publicly rebuking a leader from another local church online. Does that mean that another leader online said something and he rebuked him? But what?
Yeah, I don't
The,
know
the
what's being modified by
yeah, the
online.
modifier is a little off. Okay. But anyway, Matthew 18, he said, doesn't apply to elders and leaders. Okay. And they offered
Oh,
1 Timothy 5:20 as a better option, which you want to look that up for me real quick.
yes.
So 1 Timothy 5:20. I had privately messaged him, good idea, about maybe that he was incorrect for publicly calling out said brother without reaching out to him in private first. What does 1 Timothy 5:20 say?
It says, "Them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear."
Which is speaking to elders, correct? Or is that the context of just believers in general in the
To give
church?
you the context back a few verses, it says, "Against an elder receive not accusation, but
Yeah.
before two or three witnesses. Them that rebuke before
Yes.
all, them that sin rebuke before all, that
Yeah.
others may fear." So, yes, I presume that's in the context of elders.
Yeah. Okay. So he's saying basically, on the one side, he's saying, "Don't you think you should approach him person to person, brother to brother?" And the other one's saying, "I think 1 Timothy 5:20 is that he's an elder, he's sinned, and I rebuke him before all." I guess. Basic question for the podcast. Wait, let's see. Right. Okay. Basic question for the podcast. Is there any situations between believers where Matthew 18:15 through 17 doesn't apply as it was asserted? So I think it's good to think through this one.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew 18 is a typical, we say, church discipline passage. And
Yes.
15 through 17 specifically says, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault." Let me slow down. Actually, what the text says. "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican." Um, so he's asking here, are is there any situations between believers where Matthew 18:15 through 17 doesn't apply? Now, the question you have to note from the beginning is we're not talking in his question in the context of a local church, because the conversation he was having with somebody else was one man from one church rebuking a pastor or a
Right.
person from another church.
Yeah, I was going to
So
say that the,
yeah.
the answer to this question is going to depend on your particular ecclesiology. Whether you are what they would call local church only,
Mhm.
or see something larger than that.
Mhm.
Because I've heard some say that this really doesn't apply at all to anyone outside of your local church, which I think is kind of an extreme view.
I think so, because
Because
obviously we must have some accountability to brother, right? Within the family of
Right.
God around the
Well, and
world.
not only that, if practical advice like Matthew 18, like the structure that's given there,
Mhm.
if it works practically within the church, it's practical and will work outside of the church as well. Um, I mean, duh. I mean,
Yeah,
it's good
yeah.
advice, not just for within the church, the local church, but outside of it as well. So yeah, I think the answer will depend on your particular ecclesiology here. There are, I think, some instances in which it's unwise to draw the situation back to the private approach first, because it does begin with the private one-to-one approach, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And that is instances where something has happened publicly that needs immediate attention,
Right.
right?
Mhm. Yep.
Personal example here. When I was pastoring in Connecticut, we once had a man and his wife came in and they were very angry with each other. You could tell. And this is like 2 minutes before the service started. He started yelling at her and berating her, like
Oh
at the
boy.
top of his voice, publicly in front of the church. Well, should I have gone over to him and privately, brother to the brother said, hey, brother, I think what you did was wrong there. And, you know, no, 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 I went and I talked to him right there, right then. I didn't say, hey, let's set up a meeting where we can talk privately about this. No, you have to deal with it right there. And public apology was made before the church a little while later. But all that to say, there are some instances where the formality of the process of Matthew 18 almost takes away from the urgency of the circumstance.
Uh-huh.
If someone is publicly declaring, in front of the church, a heretical view,
Hmm.
right? I think sometimes, depending on the circumstance, because you could get into endless examples
Right,
where
right,
there's
right, right.
nuance, but sometimes things should be said immediately and say, well, no, that's incorrect, and here's why we don't believe that as a church, and that really shouldn't be done or said. Um, all that to say, are you in a sense breaking from the process of Matthew 18 by immediately dealing with something like that publicly? Well, you kind of are, really,
Right, right.
in a sense, because it was a public matter.
Right, and I guess I would maybe even point in that situation in Matthew 18 where he says, "If thy brother trespass against thee," well, when he states
Yeah,
heresy, that's not so much trespass against you; it's a statement of heresy. I mean, it has to be dealt
right.
with. So there's that, and then even just in the article that he links to, uh, which we can link to as well. I think there's some good ideas in here as to when does Matthew 18 not apply. But one of the suggestions is engaging with ideas in the public square, and that would be one thing to say. Any believer ought to mature and to grow to where they can discuss concepts just like we're doing now and be challenged. Um, and that challenge doesn't have to necessarily constitute a rebuke for a sin, but simply a challenge of the thought. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Somebody says, well, somebody said to me recently, well, you know what I think Paul's thorn in the flesh was. And he told me something, and I'd never heard that before. And I was tempted to say,
An ingrown toenail.
yeah, like, well, brother,
Yeah.
and it was something that I go, I don't know that I'd say that really. I see it differently, but I can challenge you on that, or we can talk about that. Is that a formal rebuke of heresy? No, nor is it really a trespass against me.
Hmm.
And I'm, if we're in a group of people, do I pull them aside and say, "Hey, brother, I see it differently"? Well, no, just talk about the thought. I mean, have the
Yeah.
conversation. Have
Yeah.
some substantive conversations, and expecting that the church is going to have a wide range of people in various stages of growth and biblical knowledge. You're going to have conversations like that. You're going to have people that have very little literacy in scripture. And so they're going to come up with some pretty strange ideas sometimes. And so
Yeah.
that idea to be challenged doesn't have to run through the Matthew 18 process. Um,
Yeah.
Another one he deals with, where you mentioned dealing with public known sin by a member of your church. Okay, it's happened publicly. It needs to be dealt. I think there's certainly wisdom to deal with it publicly to show that it's
Hmm.
been dealt with. Of course, you mentioned the issue of heresy, a little different. Um, and one other one.
Which, side note, and I think we've
Yeah.
talked about it before. Do you remember the meaning of the word heresy in the original is the idea of a divider. So
Okay.
someone who's causing divisions.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes we mistakenly just think we focus on it being like an erroneous idea, which may be a cause of division, but the word itself is a little more broad than just an erroneous idea. It could be someone dividing for any unnecessary reason. Any unnecessary division is a heresy.
Which is interesting. I don't know that I jump on that wagon yet. I love word studies, and I appreciate looking back to the original idea of the word. Though, yeah, that kind of brings into the whole conversation what's unnecessary. That's the whole
Yeah.
what's the old one? Essentials and in essentials, unity. In what's the other one?
In
Oh,
non-essentials,
and non-essentials. Yeah, there you go. Non-essentials.
liberty,
Uh,
something like that.
yeah. So yeah, that would be the question there. But uh, interesting. Iresis. I'd have to look at that one. Um, in the article here, he mentions one amongst like church staff. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
you could look at that one. But then he says bringing charges against an elder or pastor for sexual misconduct. Well, honestly, I guess my question is, does it even just have to be for sexual misconduct? I mean, what if the pastor? I guess sexual misconduct would be a private thing, because if a pastor got up and he said something, I mean, absolutely heretical from the pulpit, which is it's kind of a silly hypothetical because it seems like a guy would be vetted. You know what I mean?
Mm,
If he's been in church
I've
20
seen it
years,
happen.
have you? All of a sudden he
Mhm.
stands up and just says something wildly not unscriptural, but just anti-scriptural. Um, I guess that's a public thing. Somebody could stand up right there and say, "No, pastor, no." But
Mhm.
for sexual misconduct, what would you say about that?
If
Is the
if
fear that this man could slander me first cause enough for me to jump step one and go immediately with some witnesses?
uh, clarify for me the scenario that you're
So this
painting.
man this man commits a sin of which others don't know. I become aware of it, and I think if I go to him and I confront him with this, he may take me to the pulpit, accuse me of things, and get the public view against me, before I can ever bring anybody else into the situation. You know, so should I skip step one of the personal confrontation to one on one and immediately take it to the church, like take it to the deacons, or immediately take two or three witnesses with me? Um, you know what I mean? Is there cause to jump steps there, or just to jump the whole process?
Mm.
That's what he's saying
I
here.
I feel like if the scenario ends up there, there's already been a number of failures leading up to it that would make it difficult for you to address right away.
Mm,
So, for a man to really get involved with that, he's already in a position of no accountability.
mm. You're saying the
And
pastor,
the
that
pastor,
pastor, yeah.
yeah, yeah, he's already in a position where there's no one else to hold him accountable, either for his private activity or for his public testimony or his preaching. He's essentially above the law and he's untouchable. If he's gotten that far in that kind of behavior,
Mm.
something has gone wrong, and now all of a sudden you're going to come up and try to bring a measure of accountability for something that you've uncovered. Um, well, I think, oh man, it's hard to really say what would happen there because it's just my mind is going a bunch of different directions. Because believe it or not, I've actually seen that happen before.
Hmm.
Not only with prominent examples within fundamentalism, but even some lesser known ones. I knew of a pastor one time who was privately counseling a pretty young girl
Hmm.
up near his bedroom all the time, alone. Dumbest thing you could possibly do.
Yeah.
And the uh, the I don't want to say too much, but nothing could be done in the situation because it was just basically witness's word against the pastor's word, and there
Hmm.
wasn't more than really one witness.
So you're saying
So
there couldn't be two or three witnesses because there weren't witnesses.
right.
Hmm.
So it's like, what are you going to do in that case? You know, who's going to be an impartial party to judge the situation? Who's going to come in and investigate and ask questions? Well, I mean, that's in one sense one of the downsides of our independence as local churches, if you could say that there are downsides. That's one of the downsides is that who's going to hold a pastor accountable? Who's going to hold the man accountable when he already kind of leads the place with sort of an iron fist, and then he goes and does something stupid, and then it's the witness' word against his, and
Well,
it,
and
it's a mess.
maybe maybe this goes to the issue, without answering that, going to the issue of building a case, as it were.
Hmm.
If he is, the text says, if he has trespassed against thee, which implies that there's been an overstepping of a bound, that's something that's a legitimate sin. And I'm not talking about a disagreement, or a misunderstanding, a sin. Because when you confront him about that sin, he doesn't listen to you. You take two or three witnesses to the apparently the sin, and I don't know that they're even witnesses to the sin. They're witnesses to the conversation. But what you'd have to do is you would have to prove in front of those witnesses, in your conversation with this brother, that you have a case. Because
Hmm.
what if somebody came to you and they were accusing you and said, "Hey Tom, you did wrong." You're like, "No, I didn't. I, no, the way what you're talking about, either I didn't do, or this was actually the case." You would be explaining, "No, no, no, you misunderstood. This was not. That's not what actually happened." So Matthew 18 is talking about a known, provable sin, right?
Hmm.
That you can take before the church and say, "This happened. There were witnesses. This is the truth." He will not respond to confrontation. Now we deal with it. It's not
Yeah.
talking about sketchy stuff where I think he's a liar. Well, how do you know that? Well, because, and then you say some, half-cocked story or whatever.
Right.
It's got to be something serious, notable,
Now, wouldn't it though be in a sense also dicey territory to take that to the nth degree, where you would have to be the one that was sinned against? Because it does say if he sinned against you, right? Singular, you,
Right. Well,
thee. If what if you're not the one that was sinned against, right? Are you
mm,
just supposed to keep quiet? I wouldn't think so.
hmm. Interesting. So, like, what are you thinking about? Like, if you saw someone else sinned okay, okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, because if you saw, say, someone else being abused, and they're not gonna speak up for themselves, but
Right.
you're gonna address it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm. That's,
But I do think there's enough other supporting scripture about um, about keeping each other accountable
yeah.
that I don't necessarily have to be the one who was sinned against for me to be able to approach a brother and say, "Hey, I kind of observed this. I
Well, sure.
yeah, like
In
if you,
Matthew 18:15 through 17, it doesn't have to cover every possible offense and the only way to handle an offense in the church. You know what
Mhm.
I'm saying? Um, what you're talking about is Paul to Peter saying, "Hey, you did wrong. You all of a sudden, when Jewish people showed up,
you were a
you
hypocrite."
yeah, you were a hypocrite." Well, it wasn't against Paul, but Paul saw it for what it was
Right.
and withstood him to the face.
Yeah.
Well, okay, fair enough. Brother to brother.
Yep.
They weren't even necessarily part of the same church, but they're certainly part of the, maybe if you will, the leadership of Christianity, but in that age. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I don't think Matthew 18:15 through 17 necessarily has to cover every scenario of the family, of the big C church around the world, and every possible scenario necessarily. But it certainly
Yeah.
gives you a template, that if you're offended with a brother, instead of going and talking to seven other people about it and just tearing up his name, why don't you go talk to him about it? Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
if you don't feel like you can actually go talk to him about it because it's sort of trivial and stupid, well, then maybe he didn't actually trespass against you in a grievous way that you shouldn't just forgive, and move on.
Right.
But
Yeah. There are some things that it would be wiser to, like you say, are trivial, and overlooking it in a sense and giving him room to correct it himself and room to grow, and might be wise at times. But yeah, which makes instructions like Matthew chapter 7, the judge not chapter, famously, makes that so important, because I feel like if Matthew 18 is in the hands of the wrong person, you end up with someone who's just the thought police of
right,
the
yeah,
church.
he's
And
chasing every
yep.
possible little offense of immaturity through the ranks.
Right. Right. So I feel like it's not like, should I enact Matthew 18. It's the question should be, must I? Must
Yeah,
I?
that's interesting because you think about love covereth a multitude of sins. Obviously,
Yeah.
love's not covering for sin. It's not looking the other way while sin happens. But, that concept of
Yeah.
forgiveness and things like that, and I guess when does an maybe partly it's, well, let's see, I'm thinking of offense.
Well, isn't it in the Proverbs somewhere where it says something about it being the glory of a man to pass over a transgression?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Um, so there are some balancing verses in Scripture
Yeah, yeah, I think
to
that's a
to
good point.
balance out the concept of constantly approaching brethren whenever I see something that I think is wrong. There is a balance to that.
Yep, yep.
There's some nuance here, and it's not quite as black and white as we'd like it to be. The answer really is we need to live with discernment and, in many ways, be sort of focused so much on straightening our own life out first that we
Mm,
just don't have time to mess with other people's.
mm.
I
Well,
feel
at
like
least
that would be a good approach.
I think coupled with this passage, you'd also have the passage in Corinthians where he says, "Are you guys are taking each other to law? Aren't you guys
Mm,
mature enough to handle this in the body?" Well, that's kind of what he's talking about. Is that if something obvious has happened, can we not take it to the body and say, "Look,
right.
brother, you borrowed the man's car, you ran it into a tree, he didn't have insurance, that's on you. You need to, whatever." To handle
Can
that
I
with Go ahead.
can I add a technical side note to that? A sidebar we
Yeah.
could say, just as a cautionary tale to our listeners. I have known of churches that took that passage to mean that you really should avoid at all costs taking things to the law,
Oh.
and they ignored statutory issues within the church, things that were actual crimes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, goodness. No, right.
Yes,
That's right.
and the pastor got in trouble um, because he didn't take it to the authorities. So
Right. There are
just
certain
just a sidebar.
yes, criminal behavior is within the jurisdiction of the government, the powers that be that God has ordained, and you
Yes,
need to let them do their job.
yes.
Good. Okay, let's see here. Um, are law and grace opposites?
No, next question. Okay,
Thank you.
so let me explain. Okay, I would say that, so, like, taking one word at a time, the opposite of law would be licentiousness or lawlessness.
Good.
Well, that's not grace.
Right.
And the opposite of grace would be injustice, in a sense, or um, no, I take that back. Let me no, because you can do the opposite of grace and still be just. You could punish someone according to the law, and you're still just, but yet you didn't extend them grace in doing so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although I think I'd argue that you still are being there is still a grace in that. But
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I don't
maybe on
know.
a pedantic technicality. Yes, I agree with that.
What's wrong with the case? Um,
But
is
yeah, I
would
don't think
opposite
they're
of grace
exact.
be works? When in Romans he says if
Well,
it's
see,
of grace, it's not of works. If it's of works, it's
okay,
not of
so
grace.
we need to back up for context. Then
Okay.
I'm talking essentially about the virtue of grace.
Okay.
It sounds like to me you're thinking more of the soteriology surrounding grace, which I think are different discussions. Um, so if you're talking about soteriology, that we are saved by God's grace, well, then, yeah, I could see how one could argue that works would be the opposite of that, that you're saved by works. That's the opposite of being saved by grace, I think. Um, but the virtue of showing grace, the
Mhm, mhm,
opposite of that, I think, would be, in a sense, the word that keeps coming to mind is retribution, or
hmm.
um, volatility. Or I'm struggling to find the right
I think
word, but
maybe I would say corruption or evil in a sense.
okay.
I'm just thinking when it says for the grace of God, and I know it's the grace of God that bringeth salvation, but The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, you should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this
Yeah.
present world. The very interaction and nature of God revealed to us teaches us things. It doesn't just save us; it teaches us. We see God for who He is. He's a God of grace, and that grace has
Yeah.
conveyed so much. So
Well,
what would the
to back
opposite?
up even further, I guess we should maybe talk a little more about what we mean by grace, like the
Mm,
word.
yeah, yeah.
That we like to go back to the Greek word, which, if I remember right, is charis
Mhm.
and has
Sounds right.
something to do with a gift.
Can be related, yes.
Can be related to gift. The
To
idea of a gift, but we often just think of that, and I suppose maybe this is the limitation of our finite minds. We think of that in terms of receiving a thing, but grace can also be receiving an ability. And you talk about the places where Paul discusses his toil and lament and the things that he'd experienced, the hardships that he'd experienced. And I'm trying to remember exactly how he worded it, and it's eluding me. But essentially, that it was God's grace, by God's grace, that he was able to do the things that he did
hmm hmm
and endure things. In other words, God gifted him an ability to
hmm
continue despite insurmountable sufferings. So grace doesn't have to be just a thing, an intrinsic thing that's given. It can also be an ability that we don't have that God gives us. That's the idea of the gift of grace. So when we talk about the opposite of grace, I don't know, would that be the selfishness, maybe?
Yeah, wow, that's right. I think you're on a right track there. I didn't even intend the question to be that, but boy, that really ends up being an interesting one to answer. And I'm going to ask our listeners if you've got a thought on that. Could you think of a word or even a statement that would express the opposite of grace as expressed in Scripture? Let us know at reasontogetherpodcast at
Yeah.
gmail.com. That's reasontogetherpodcast at gmail.com. Now, to
Yeah.
continue with the idea, so you got, I'm just going to share this. This verse is really neat. I think it's Second Corinthians, is it 9:8? Yes. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. So, like you say, the grace of God bestowing ability, or
Mhm.
its sufficiency, its provision. The grace of God, the giving of God, if you will. Um, so to kind of come back to my original, our law and grace opposite, I guess I just kind of get this feel, this sense, and tell me if I'm wrong, or if you get, not if I'm wrong, but if you get the same uh, sense, that people see grace as opposite from law. Particular, like just give him some grace, or and maybe they do this with mercy too. I think it's a very related concept. It's either merciful or it's just. Well, I don't know that those have to be opposite, but and we talk about there's been an idea of grace parenting in the past
Mm.
several years, and
Mhm.
I don't know this, but is grace parenting that you need to exercise grace? Don't. Is that trying to say, well, what is that saying? Is that saying that there is no law, like you don't enforce restrictions and there's no consequences for violating certain boundaries? Well, what does that mean, that we're focusing on grace?
Mhm.
I just sense that they're splitting the two. And actually, I say no, no. The giving. In fact, I'm in the middle of a parenting book right now that's really good, and it's kind of been stirring me. But he's talking about grace and the gospel. But I think he also recognizes that the giving of the law, um, is a gift. It is a grace.
Hmm.
that God, that we are naturally built to self-destruction, and God reveals himself, and that is expressed in certain commands that are actually um, helping to protect us from ourselves,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
give us
Well,
those
sure.
governing guidelines to protect us and to show us himself. And so to me, the law is an
Like
expression
a like
of
a
his grace.
schoolmaster
Exactly.
to teach us something, to
Right.
bring us
To
to Christ.
point us to the grace that actually saves. So to
Hmm.
me, it's a complement to, it's a step toward, it's a tool of grace. It's certainly not the opposite of grace.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And that's we've talked about grace parenting before in the
Okay.
past. And I don't know that we've come down on the schoolmaster passage
Mm.
before when talking about it, but that helps. I get it. That I get it better now. That yeah, parenting must involve law
Yeah. And
in
sure.
order to eventually get to grace.
And where we can go wrong is by thinking that, well, if they violate the law, I just, like, my parenting is defined by laws, and laws are going to make my child what he should be. Well, that's not really true,
Hmm.
because he can live inside of those laws as long as he has to, or you can be so restrictive that he just breaks the fence and he runs away and says, I don't want to
Hmm.
be any part of that, because the law can't really change the heart, but it can expose the heart and give us a point of reference to say, now, son, daughter, you've broken this because you are this way. I am this way. We are this way. But we
Hmm.
look to the grace of God that changes us. Is there a consequence for violating the law? Yeah, I'd say oftentimes there is. But at the same time, it's also a wonderful opportunity to be pointing them to that which actually can change them. Um,
Hmm.
and and yeah, so
Excellent.
good.
Excellent. Wholeheartedly agree.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're right at that point. We've only got a few minutes, and so we're going to start. We're going to begin shifting here into the after show, which is available to our elite patrons, and amazed and thankful for our patrons, but especially those who invest as much as they do per episode, to be elite patrons. If you go to patreon.com/reason together and you sign up for the elite patron level, you will get a free t-shirt, and you'll get access to this after show, which is just about after every episode that we have. So you almost double the number of episodes that you have available to listen to. Um, and you can, once you become an elite patron, you have access then back to all of our bonus episodes going back. I don't remember when we started this. So
Not
anyway,
since the beginning, but
no,
we
no.
didn't always have an after show, but
Right,
yeah.
but there's several. But anyway,
Yeah.
thank you, elite patrons. And again, if you have a thought on grace, there on law and grace, on faith and fear, on Matthew 18, and confronting a brother, holding an elder responsible, hey, send it our way. Reason Together Podcast at gmail.com. That's Reason Together Podcast at gmail.com. And if you're not an elite patron, we'll see you next time. Otherwise, we'll see you on the other side here.
All right. Thank you for being with us. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.